So let's talk about Gestalt psychology. It was so important for Merleau-Ponty, and while, again, he takes so much from Gestalt psychology, he also wants to go beyond it and critique what in it remains kind of tied to these classical prejudices, because he thinks that most of Gestalt psychology still remains tethered to certain features of the classical prejudice. So the big idea in Gestalt psychology, Gestalt is German for whole or organization or a ensemble of relations. So the big idea is that we see or we perceive wholes rather than parts. Our mind, our body, our perceptual apparatus, our habit body, all of those tend towards seeing a whole. That's the more natural way of perceiving things. That's the more spontaneous way in which we perceive things. So we can think here of like a bunch of examples, but we can read a jumbled text without having to really like use our intellect or our consciousness in its aesthetic operation in order to make sense of it. Our perception already tends towards a simplified form that is familiar, and we kind of fill in the details when needed, right? And there are endless examples within Gestalt psychology of this. We can also think of continuity. We see a continuity in a broken line. I mean, in purely atomistic perception, each of these lines is its own discrete entity. Why should we perceive them as having a unity? And we see them as being a kind of curved line, even though it's actually a bunch of lines. So that is where perception is doing some work, right? I mean, there's not actually a continuity there, but we tend to perceive a whole rather than a bunch of random details and parts. We fill in the gaps. So this is the big idea in Gestalt psychology, that the whole is greater than or different than the sum of the parts. In fact, the quote is different than the sum of the parts, although oftentimes people will say greater than the sum of the parts, and sometimes that is a important aspect of a Gestalt to realize that it's more. But the original quote, I mean, it originally comes from Aristotle, and he says different than the sum of the parts. And then in Gestalt, they really emphasize that it's different than the sum of the parts. They have sort of gotten angry at people misquoting them, saying more than the sum of the parts instead of different than the sum of the parts. I personally think that both are important and valid ways of describing this. They just emphasize different aspects of a whole and holism and things like that. But a whole is always different than its parts. It is not simply a sum of parts. The parts can also form several different gestalts. This is what Merleau-Ponty calls a modulation. A modulation is a movement from one norm to another, and each norm is what organizes a gestalt, an open system of relations that is more than or different than the sum of its parts. A figure always stands out from a background. This is the basic structure of all of our perceptions. But the figure and the background are not two discrete entities either. They are moments of a single whole, such that neither the figure nor the background pre-exists or succeeds or is reduced to the other, right? So we can imagine that the background is really just out of focus objects, right? Like everything is a figure, and the background is one of those kind of secondary properties of our perception. It just so happens that when we perceive things, other things fade into the background. Therefore, background is reducible to figure. I mean, if anything, background is more fundamental than a figure. But even that is a wrong way of thinking about it. We need to think of them as moments of a single whole. So the figure is not the gestalt. The gestalt is the figure and the background as a single whole. And I'll just mention really quick, too, that Gestalt psychology was originally developed by Wertheimer and Kohler and Kafka. Kafka is not the Kafka of the novelist. And then was further developed by Goldstein and Gurwitch. And those two are the ones who had a really big influence on Merleau-Ponty. Gurwitch wrote a book on the relation between Husserl's Phenomenology and Gestalt psychology, which was very influential on Merleau-Ponty. So those are the people he's drawing from, and that's the basic idea of Gestalt psychology. The world is not built up from elementary parts, atoms. Neither is perception, neither is the world, put together in kind of abstract assemblages like building blocks. We're not putting Legos together in our perceptual field, nor in the physical world or in life. It's not about discrete parts being abstractly juxtaposed. It's all about taking the relation over the relata, right? Not the things that are being related, but the ensemble of relations. So let's talk a little bit more about background. The background is something which we encounter provisionally when we're perceiving anything as the context of that thing, right? It's a whole. The background is a whole. It's part of a whole, and it is the whole. But it's a whole which isn't present all at once. So a background is the whole in which the figure from which the figure emerges, but is not present ever at once in the way a figure is present. And even figures aren't present entirely all at once, right? We've talked about how when I look at a screen, I appresent the back of the screen, and therefore even the figure as a thing is only quasi-present, and it has a back which is also quasi-present. So a gestalt has this complex texture of qualities to it in its background, and it also has a sense-making context that gives a common orientation and meaning. It establishes or institutes a kind of norm that makes sense of the things appearing in that context. So the background is when we first start and when we just interact with things in our kind of everyday natural attitude. For the most part, this background is what orients and positions things in relation to each other as reflected in our projects, in our organismic, embodied, intentional life in the world, right? So the context of things, their background, is partially the spot which they hold in the perceptual field, as much as it is the significance of that thing in our life and in our projects. A thing is always already fit into a meaningful structure of our familiarity and our habituation in the world. Thus, a background is something that changes from time to time depending on our location, our socio-cultural norms, our milieu, historical institutions of meaning, and, basic embodied life, which is often modulating those norms and those intentional structures. The background is related immediately to both space and time. It's this envelope which takes in all perceived objects and gives them a meaning and a context and a horizon that goes beyond them. It's more fundamental phenomenologically than space as a geometrical conception of space or of time as something that we count and that we place ourselves in through consciousness, understanding things before and after each other. There is this background sense of space and time, which is phenomenologically more primary. We can think about this in the sense that presence is always a figure, so that the present always stands out from the past and the future. The past and the future are the background or the horizon of the present. In the same way that here stands out as a present spot, as a loci, a place, and there is an elsewhere as the background, and the horizon, literally the horizon is over there and elsewhere in space. And I mentioned this already, but gestalts can modulate. And the modulation, so modulation is a term which Merleau-Ponty takes from music, and we'll talk about this more in the next module. But modulation is when you switch from one key to another key. And those keys do not overlap. If you play them over top of each other, harmony is destroyed. So you have to move to a new norm in order to modulate to a new key. And the key in that sense is the gestalt. It's the background. It's what makes sense of all the notes and makes all the notes cohere as a whole and gives them continuity and coherence. So in the same way that in music we can modulate a key and move to a different key, in perception we modulate our gestalt. And this is a famous example, the duck and the rabbit. You can see it as a duck, you can see it as a rabbit, and you can modulate between those norms, modulate between those gestalts. It's a way of making that appear as a whole. So I want to dive deeper into the different kinds of background, because background functions in many different ways for Merleau-Ponty, and here I'm using terms that go beyond what how Merleau-Ponty describes it, but I think it's going to be helpful. So we can think of a provisional background in a provisional state, meaning background, how we encounter it immediately in our perceived world, is something that can be shifting, right? If I turn my attention to this thing, then I turn it to this thing. I can look at different objects and then the background changes when I look at different objects. So when I'm looking at this one, there's the background, but it's only provisional because as soon as I look at an object in that background, the background changes and the foreground changes and the figure changes. So in this sense, figure background is unthematized. It's something we don't think about consciously. It's something that we do in our perception. We look around and notice different objects, and the background shifts as we look at different things, right? And in this provisional sense, the background is always this kind of concrete, actual objects and historical meaning that we have become familiar to in our own life. The thing and its background are always correlated. It's always this thing with this background, and that is a unique, concrete being in our personal history, in our cultural history, and again, we can always modulate and shift this sense of background. Now, we can move to a deeper level, which we might call primary background. And this is something thematized. This is something that a psychologist, a phenomenologist has isolated as a concept to some degree, has given a description of it, which we verify for ourselves in our own experience. So when we talk in class and in philosophy and in phenomenology about backgrounds, we talk about it as something thematized, right? It's no longer this constant within our perceptual transcendental structure. It is now a concept which we discuss and describe, and which we draw out the implications of. It's something that has become an intellectual object. It's something that, we've taken it out of its concrete context, and have attempted to describe it intellectually. That doesn't mean it's entirely removed from historical, social, economic, psychoanalytic, ethnographic contexts. It can't be entirely removed from those just by becoming a concept. But it's something we try to investigate in all of those contexts, in a historical, in a social, in a psychoanalytic, in an ethnographic context, right? So it's something that we can elucidate to increasing degrees of clarity, but this intellectual reflection that we put on the phenomenon is never absolute. It never completely removes background from its status as background. It's always an incomplete kind of thing. It's always a contingent type of thing. So it has a kind of threshold of adequacy, which when we reach that threshold, we say, I know what a background is. I have a description of it and all of that is accurate enough to be useful in understanding psychological phenomenon or something like that. But it can never become a thing. It can never become a concept fully. A thing tends to be a general type, and we tend to ignore the concrete details of individual things when we typify them. But background always remains something phenomenologically primary, and doesn't become fully a concept. So while this is the primary sense of background, it's the sense of background that the gestalt psychologist uses and that Merleau-Ponty tries to use. It's not actually background in the most fundamental sense, we could say. Background in the most fundamental sense is the common background. Common here meaning the background of all backgrounds, the ultimate background of backgrounds. What is the background of all backgrounds? Nature in its temporality of sense-making. Its historical, evolutionary, concrete being, right? So the background of nature is analogous to a past that was never present. A context that is the context of all context. It is never cognizable, never definable. It's the ultimate container of all perspectives that is not itself subject to a perspective. It's not a figure. It cannot be made a figure of. So this is background in a very deep and profound sense that is extremely difficult to talk about. But this idea of the nature as the ultimate background of all backgrounds is going to be really important in this course moving forward. So I just want to flag it now as extremely important. So backgrounds can become our objects of thought, although in doing so, we always reduce them to a kind of abstract sense. So it's paradoxical because the background is by definition something on the periphery or on the horizon, something far off, at the edges of our spotlight consciousness, at the edges of thetic consciousness, on the periphery. The true background, this past that was never present, the background of all backgrounds, nature, this cannot be made into a concept. The background of the primary background reveals this kind of genesis point that makes possible an approach to nature as the background of all experience, as a fact of experience, that there's a horizon that recedes from all figures. So when we look at the primary background as a concept, when we try and approach it conceptually through reflective consciousness, we find this kind of residue, you might say, of something that goes beyond it, something that escapes it, something that cannot be taken into thetic consciousness. In the same way, there's a kind of common temporality, a past of all past, a unison of becoming among all physical things, among all consciousnesses, among all temporalities. This unison of becoming is a present, a passing present of becoming. It suggests to us that there is a past that exceeds all present, all passing, all becoming. A past that was never becoming. A past that was never present. I know that's a paradoxical and crazy idea, but we'll come into that in more detail to try and make sense of it better later. So the way of being of the primary background is fundamentally different than the way of being of this common background. I'm partially taking these terms, provisional, primary, common, from Aristotle in his exposition of the idea of place. So he says that there's a provisional place, a primary place, and a common place. And common place for Aristotle is the divine. It's the eternal present being which always is and is always perfect and always unchanging. It's this constant being of divinity which makes possible the places of the world, the sublunar realm where we live, the place of the stars, all of that. All of that is kind of enveloped in, for Aristotle, is all enveloped in the commonplace. So the commonplace is completely other and different from all other types of place. It is the grounding place that makes possible all other place. And something very similar is the case for Merleau-Ponty with this idea of background. So nature is this constant which is not capable of being represented or quantified. It is a kind of burgeoning or opening up of sense. It's the opening from which sense emerges. And here we can think of Hesiod in the Theogony, where he begins by saying that there's chaos, and chaos is this opening from which being spills into. The background is kind of like that. It's something that we could never look into the face of. It's not the void that we stare into, because you can't even stare into it. And it's not a sort of materialistic view of a stuff that we start with. The background is not just the matter from which anything arises. Matter has generally, in materialism, been treated as something lacking sense, meaning, signification, primary, secondary qualities of Locke, this bifurcation of nature. Matter has been treated as something meaningless. And the background is not like that. The background is not something meaningless from which meaning emerges. It's the ultimate context of meaning. So that's going to be hard to get our heads around, but it's the sense-making background that can never be explicitly made sense of. So nature is this background, and it's something corporeal, it's something significant, and it's something expressive. And it's also something that's always already unfolding itself with its own immanent causality that is irreducible to any kind of abstract hylomorphism, any kind of matter-form distinction. So we're not taking the background as the matter and the figure as the form and saying that the matter is determined by the form, right? We're not saying that the meaning is determined by its appearance as a form. The germ of every institution of sense, or of any organism as a kind of integral unity, a kind of whole, it's always integral from the start. It's always complete from the start. It's always whole from the start. We do not take a bunch of building blocks and put them together in order to create something whole. In the same way, we don't take matter or a juxtaposition of atoms from this original background and then combine them in order to make an appearance of an object or a figure. There's no juxtaposition of building blocks or rearrangement of building blocks. And this connects again to the idea of style. Style, it finds an expression in a plurality of embodiments, each of which has its own temporal profile. So the sense of its being is intimately intertwining physical and ideal, material and mental, corporeal and spiritual, part and whole. There's no prior existence of the physical, material, corporeal parts, and then the emergence of the ideal. From the first moment, we have something integral and something whole. So for Gestalt psychology, nature is alive with meaning, and gestalts, gestures, styles, these open systems of structure, they're the birthplace of sense. We don't start with something abstract and then get something concrete. We don't start with parts and then form a whole. Sense is always already spatio-temporally existing. It's always in a process of meaning institution and evolution. Merleau-Ponty's ontology of sense and expression involve or imply a cosmology of organic and dynamic organismic evolution. And again, this cosmology has a metaphysics to it, an organic, evolutionary dynamic metaphysics, as I've pointed out before. I would say that it has a kind of process ontology that it is grounded in. And Merleau-Ponty read Whitehead in his later works and talks about him very positively. Also, Bergson is a big influence on Merleau-Ponty and was a big influence on Whitehead. So this metaphysics, this process ontology, this organismic metaphysics, all of that is implied in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. The phenomenological aspect of it gives us access to a different aspect than the metaphysical and the cosmological give us access to. Through it, we get to this genesis of meaning in consciousness, and we root consciousness in embodied perception and motricity.